right. Well, thank you, Henry, and good afternoon to everyone who's joining us, or good morning if you, like me, are on the other side of the Atlantic. And thank you, Henry, for everything you do to advance the cause of building workplaces where people thrive. I'm sorry I'm not able to be there in person, but delighted to have the chance and share some thoughts and have a dialogue on a topic that I'm really, really passionate about, which is how to build organizations that elicit and deserve all the ingenuity, all the initiative, all the passion that human beings can bring at work. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Let's see if I can share my slides. Let me see here. All right. So that it's not just me talking. Tell me if you can see like the title slide.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right.
Yeah, we can see that.
All right, great. So here's my plan for the session. I'd like to spend first 10 minutes or so just to provide some context around this challenge. Why do organizations often struggle, right, to be as capable as the people inside them? And, spoiler alert, it's a set of specific practices and mindset that are still very rooted in the kind of 19th century idea of military command structures and industrial engineering, or what I call bureaucracy. And we'll get into that later. The second is, second part, I want to focus on alternatives to this bureaucratic model, and we'll distill some lessons from organizations that have broken the mold and built work environments that maximize the contribution of all their members. And then we'll wrap up by talking about what it takes for an organization to make progress on this front. And I'll set each section up for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for a discussion and before moving on to the next. And last preamble, 30 minutes of me, kind of unpacking some of this isn't a lot of time to, give justice to the broader argument. So I apologize for any incidents of omissions. As Henry said, if you want to go a little bit deeper in theory and the practice, there's a book that I recently wrote with Gary called Bureaucracy. And I'm actually working on a second edition, which will have lots of more case studies and details. And that should be out hopefully at the end of this year, early next. So anyway, let's get going if you're ready for it. And let's start with this idea of like understanding with the context and what our organization is really up against. And let me start maybe with a question for you to consider. In what organizations are people most inclined, right, to give the very best, to move fast, to stretch themselves, right, to challenge conventional thinking? Just ponder that for a second. And I'll share with you like kind of my answer to this, which is it's a startup. Often it is that kind of work environment, right? And the real advantage of a startup is not so much the business model, but the people inside it. Employees that are united on a passion to break new grounds. Teams are small, roles are flexible, as are policies. There are very few levels and little pressure to just conform, and maybe more openness to people being their true selves, as we heard about before. There are ambitious goals and timelines that really push everyone to do more with less, right? And initiative is highly valued. You're encouraged to take risks, right? So in a way, startups are bold, simple, lean, open, and free, right? But what happens as they grow successful, as they mature? Often when you come back a decade or so later, all of that has changed. And this is kind of a broad pattern. And let me just give you an example that caught my kind of imagination last year. And this is Meta, Facebook. So this is a quote from Mark Zuckerberg in 2011. And one of his big theories is that all companies slow dramatically as they grow. It's actually a fact, not a theory, but okay. And, but he thought, well, maybe when we're bigger at Facebook, we're going to be able to move as fast as we used to when we were like 500 employees, right? Because we've invested so much in building the culture, whatever that means. In a way like bureaucracy, it's culture for breakfast if you're not careful. And in fact, that's what happened at Facebook. Last year, he was talking a different tune. I don't think you want a management structure that's managing managers, managing the people who are actually doing the work, right? And it turns out Meta had 10 layers of management, which is kind of nuts. And how does that happen? And I think kind of if you've been in an organization, how that happens. As the company grows and becomes more complex, you reach an inflection point where kind of bureaucracy grows faster than the organization itself. And you've seen all these dynamics. I don't have to kind of explain these to you, right? But these are the kinds of things that happen. And pretty soon you have an organization that is not very healthy. You have a lot of bureaucratic plaque that stifles the flow of ideas, talent, and resources around the organization. Now, I've mentioned bureaucracy a few times, so it's probably good to define it, because it's an old-fashioned term, right? It's like horsepower, right? And in many ways, it is kind of an anachronism, but it's still the basic templates for most institutions of any meaningful size, right? And these are some of the characteristics that I tend to use to describe bureaucracy. You ask yourself, how many of these apply to your organizations, right? I would wager most, if not all of them do. Now, I have to say, we have to give bureaucracy its due. Yeah, it's why we could all afford driving our own cars, why we don't have to grow our own vegetables unless we want to, of course, and why organizations are capable of amazing feats like producing semiconductors at the 3 nanometer scale. And by the way, that's the length at which your fingernail grows in 3 seconds. Okay, that's at the level of precision which we are operating. And precision, stability, discipline, reliability are all organizational virtues. I'm a big fan of those. But they're not the only virtues in today's economy, right? They're kind of table stakes. They're necessary, but not sufficient, right? We need to do more than that, right? We need to inspire initiative and increase, innovation and enable organizations to intercept change proactively as opposed to be on the back foot. And the problem is that bureaucracy stifles these things, stifles the inspiration, the initiative, the ingenuity that are really required if you want to build organizations that are, daring, that are resilient, that are creative. And in our work, we've identified 7 ways, and I'm sure there are more even, in which bureaucracy kind of stifles human achievement. And I would even say human happiness in organizations, right? It ossifies structures and processes. It creates very long pathways of approvals and decision-making. It caps opportunities for individual contribution. You're kind of confined to your job, right? And you can deviate from that, and you're probably gonna encounter a lot of resistance. It frustrates the rapid redeployment resources. It makes everyone focus on their particular silo as opposed to the whole. It makes the organization very conservative and very political as well, right? And it's why incumbents at large organizations entrenched in and operating in their industry for a long time are often very slow to respond, right? I mean, you can see this in EVs and in so many other industries, like where you kind of expect the newcomers to upstage the old timers, and it's not just about the organizational performance that suffers, but also the human experience inside these organizations. People are not really bringing the best of themselves at work. And there are lots of data points for this. One of my favorites is Gallup. They do this global workplace survey, and they report that only 20% of employees around the world are fully engaged in their work. So that means the other 80%, they're not bringing in their ingenuity, their initiative, and their passion to work. And imagine like this, applying this kind of pattern to like another profession, like the medical profession, saying, visiting the doctors, going to the hospital helps 1 patient out of 5. I mean, that's kind of insane, right? But we somehow have resigned ourselves to this sad reality when it comes to organizations, that it's something that we need to actively fight against. And here's why I think this is like a really big deal, right? Picture for a moment a hierarchy of work-related capabilities, like a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So at the bottom you have obedience. And of course, you have organizations that where people are capable of following, rules around the brand, around the assisting clients. Of course, that's important. You also want people to be diligent. You want people who are willing to work hard and take responsibility for results. And of course, you'll want people to have the requisite skill, to have the expertise to do their job properly. Now, these capabilities are essential, but they seldom create value, right? These are kind of commodity capabilities. If you want to win in the creative economy, you need to do much more. You need people who have initiative, who are self-starters, right? Who aren't just being, asked, don't wait to be asked to do something. They'll just take matters in their own hands to add value or solve a problem for the customer. Equally critical is creativity, the ability to reframe problems and do something that is more than just, hey, let's copy what someone else is doing, and, really push the boundaries of what's possible. And at the very top, you want passion, right? You want people who are willing to stretch themselves and take risks for a worthy cause. And these things, initiative, creativity, and valor, you cannot command them in a kind of, bureaucratic way. You can encourage it, but then employees decide, do I bring these gifts to work or not, right? And as the Gallup data suggests, the answer is usually no, and sometimes it's hell no, right? And I think that really needs to change. Now, one of the reasons why bureaucracy runs rampant in our organizations is because it's kind of hard to measure. We have a sense, that it's there, that it's a problem, but we often lack the tools to dimensionalize the cost, right? So to help do that, we've created a little instrument called the Bureaucracy Mass Index, and it kind of helps diagnose the prevalence of the barriers that I mentioned earlier. You might want to check it out, and you can compare your answers to 16,000 other people who have taken it. But let me just give you a couple of data points from the survey. This is about a question we asked about, like, how easy it is for someone who's not super senior to start something new, right? And these are the responses for people working in firms with more than 5,000 people. So only 6% believe that there's an easy approach to do that, right? And it's no wonder innovation is something that happens very seldom in large organizations. Or another one, this is probably one of the most depressing statistics I've seen from the survey, which is how, to the extent to which politics determine who gets ahead, and how people have influence and power in organizations. And, the bigger the organization, the more politics plays a role. Not very surprising, but the fact that 2/3 of the people believe this to be the case for large organizations is pretty disheartening. All right, so that's just a quick kind of overview and of like the challenge. And the question I have for you is this: what aspect of kind of bureaucracy, what are the barriers to a human achievement do you think are most toxic and need to be addressed? And so here's the list again of these kind of 7 actually 8 buckets, and I would love to get your take on which one of these you think is most important or most toxic, and maybe you can even share an anecdote of how this has impacted you or the organization more broadly.
Okay, folks, have you got any questions for Michele?
Just an example, if I can give an example of it.
Yeah.
Which was during COVID in the NHS. Because so much was happening so quickly, all the rules fell away, and surgical teams started being able to make up rules as they went, and they became vastly more efficient. And since that time, all the layers have come back in, and all the approval layers have come back, and they've all slowed back down and so forth. But it happened because it had to happen. But what it proved was they were able to, as small teams, create spontaneously better systems than several layers of management could have done.
Yeah, that's such an important point, Paul. And typically when a crisis happens, power does move back to the periphery because the center is just overwhelmed, right? But as the crisis subsides, things go back to the way they were. And so, the challenge is how do you operate in that way, without a crisis, right? I mean, I did one of the things that I'll update the book with is Operation Warp Speed, another COVID era example in the public sector of incredible speed and laterality, which saved millions of lives. And the question is, how do we get government or organizations in general to operate at warp speed without having to face an existential crisis, right? That is the ultimate challenge. It can be done, but it's not easy for sure. Okay. I saw a question from Jason around over large staff functions. So what I mean by that is that, often a sign of a bureaucratic organization is when you have a lot of policies, procedures, and tools really being handled centrally by finance, by HR, compliance. And the idea is that, the way you get order and control is by having one, sync up and follow the same rules and procedures set by these experts at the top of the organization. And the alternative to that is actually that, you distribute the responsibility for control of compliance and those things to people in the front lines or in the line, and make their jobs a little bit richer, a little bit broader. A good example of that is Buurtzorg. I'm not going to get into that today, but you might have heard about them. They're like a home health services organization in the Netherlands. They basically it's a 10,000 person organization in terms of nurses working there in teams, and they have, I think, 50 people at the center. Right, the work of managing and dealing with HR issues, dealing with finance issues, is distributed across the organization. So that's what I mean.
Okay, Michele, let's
all right, let's keep going. All right, let me get to let's see here. Am I still sharing the screen? No, I don't think so. No. Okay, all right. So, all right, let me go back here. Okay, give me a second to get to the right place. And I promise, that's all like the Debbie Downer, all the bad news that I wanted to give you. We're now gonna turn to more positive things. And let's see here. All right. And talk a little bit about, a potential alternative. Because, you might ask, bureaucracy stinks, but like as opposed to what? Is there really an alternative, right? And I'm happy to report that the answer is yes, right? That you can be as disciplined and controlled as a larger organization, but still innovative and inspiring as a startup. And there's a number of companies around the world that are doing this. Henry can certainly talk about his own experience at Happy, right? And they're all kind of proving that you can have the cake and eat it too, right? You can be more efficient and more proactive, and more more inventive and more inspiring as a place to work. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples, just to make this really, really tangible from very different organizations. And maybe as I walk through this, these a couple of examples, you can think about it. What are similar aspects of how they're organized and managed and led, and what are different ones? So the first one will take us to Sweden and to learn more about Handelsbanken. They are based in Stockholm, but they operate in the UK. I think they have hundreds of branches in the UK, about 10,000 employees around the entire system. And they've been outperforming the industry for 50 years, and on a variety of measures. One of the things that is most remarkable is that they're being able to kind of, in a way, master some of the most difficult trade-offs in banking. So they are able to grow, right, and at the same time not take a lot of risks, and not depersonalize the customer service. Their customer service numbers are, in addition to their economics, are off the charts. And this comes from a really at the root of this is not so much their business model or their IT system and things like that, but rather the way they approach their management model, right? And so let me unpack some of the key features. So the governing thought, right, at Handelsbanken is decentralization. So the branch is the bank, right? So unlike most other branches you might find where banks you might find where the branches are essentially glorified sales and service centers, the branches at Handelsbanken own the profit and loss. They make decisions on what credit to extend it to whom, the pricing of some of their products, the staffing, their customer outreach, and all of that, right? And so they act like little startups, each branch does. And being autonomous doesn't mean that you are free from performance pressure. You still need to deliver certain results. They have this metric in banking called cost-to-income ratio, which is an efficiency measure. So there's a level that you need to be at 40% or lower for that. And if you, as a branch manager, are underperforming, you'll get replaced. Like you're not free. You're free to succeed. You're not free to snooze, right? One of the big reasons why branches exercise their autonomy responsibility is that they have skin in the game. So they, make a loan, right, to a customer, and they will hold that loan on their books to maturity. So if there's a problem with that loan, it will hit their P&L. They're not kicking it to some other unit that deals with, working out that debt, and so they will exercise that autonomy judiciously. They also have a generous profit sharing program that pays, irrespective of your role, pays the same amount every year, and then basically becomes the nest egg for an employee who stays there for most of his or her career. And now this fund, and therefore employees, own about 10% of the bank, right? And that keeps people focused on the kind of long-term health of the institution as opposed to kind of right in the next cycle. Another important reason why this works at Handelsbanken is transparency. So every bank, you can see their performance on a variety of metrics across the entire system. So it's easy to spot which branches are doing well and which are not. And if you're not doing well as others, you can learn, you can find out who's doing that particular thing really well, whether it's managing loan quality or managing headcount or whatever, and you can kind of ask them for advice. And this is what legendary kind of longtime CEO of Handelsbanken, Jan Wallander, put it, right? Peer pressure is an important part of the process. You know, the executives are not really pushing people; they're just advising, creating a system where people find their way. The other thing that is really interesting about Handelsbanken is that they're super lean. Back to this idea of staff functions, right? Super lean in terms of how many layers of management and how many people work in central administration. So I think there are only 2 layers between the branch manager and the CEO, and this is like a 10,000 person organization. And this ends up giving them a real cost advantage, right? So the branches cost more than your typical branch at you know, Barclays or whatever, but there's far less overhead to control them. So in the end, you actually get more efficiency. You can be decentralized and highly efficient. And the last reason last thing I want to say about Handelsbanken is that one of the reasons why headcount is so low, overhead, sorry, is so low, is that centralized services such as IT and HR, which, you know, still exist, are very accountable to the branches. So they basically charge services based on actual usage and not some sort of unintelligible allocation. And rates are negotiated every year between a committee of branch managers who drive kind of a hard bargain with the staff functions. And if the branch managers are not happy, right, they can go outside. So there's a deep internal focus on the customer. Anyway, so that's Handelsbanken, and this model has been around for many, many decades, very stable, very, very kind of inspiring. Let me give another example across the pond. This is an industrial company called Ingersoll Rand. They do flow control and compressor equipment. They're based in North Carolina, and you know, it's an amazing story that's come up in the last 10 years. And the CEO, Vincente Reynal, was, you know, driven really by him and this desire to build an organization where everyone thought and acted like a real owner. And they took several steps to make this happen. And I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly, you know, for the sake of time. The first thing that they did is that they gave equity grants of worth more than $250 million to employees. And they did this in 2 stages because they kind of grew and acquired different companies over time. That detail is important. What's important is that this is one of the largest equity grants ever given to employees in an industrial company. And and this, by the way, this money went to, these grants went, shares went to non-managerial employees, and they amounted to about 40% of their salary. And these are gifts. You know, they're not stock options. They're like literally, here's some shares. You can do whatever you want with them. Most of them actually have kept them and benefited from holding them because the company has done really well. Now, as this was happening, the company also flattened the pyramid. So they went from about 10 layers of management to 4, and they created autonomous teams, you know, both in production and in white-collar job. And this is a, you know, quote of, you know, that illustrates the kind of different mindset that created, right? You know, the people went from saying, this is not the company I work for, but this is sort of my company. This is my factory. You know, these are my machines. These are my tools, and I'm going to take care of them because I'm an owner, right? And so anyway, skin in the game was really important, and sort of also the autonomy, but you also need to give people the information, the tools to act judiciously as owners. And so one of the things that they trained people in the economics of the business, like even frontline people, because like they said, you know, you cannot be empowered unless you know exactly what to do, right? And how to drive the business forward, how to improve it. One quick example I'll give you is around managing cash, which sounds, you know, a little trite, but it's actually really important, and it's important for industrial business with low margin. And they, back in 2017, they were struggling with managing cash. So, you know, inventory, you know, a lot of cash tied up in inventory and in accounts payable. So what they did is, instead of calling a consulting firm to ask them how to manage that, they said, you know, we're going to train every employee in the cash conversion cycle, which is, you know, here in its full glory. And we're going to unleash them and tell them, okay, help us drive, you know, a better way to manage cash and unlock cash, right? And they did that through a training program that covered every single employee over, you know, 4 sessions, about 30 minutes long. And over time, they were able to unlock about $200 million in cash by just training people on how to manage this better, right? And you know, I was recently talking to Vincente, and he told me that you know, so cash, the training that they did unlocked about $200 million. You know, everything they've done to improve the employee experience It reduced turnover, and that was like another $200 million worth of value. And then the energy initiative that these employees used to drive the business forward unlocked another 2.5 billion. So about $3 billion worth of value from this, right? And the human impact of shared ownership at Ingersoll Rand has been pretty remarkable as well. So they went from the 19th percentile on the Gallup engagement rankings that I mentioned earlier to the 90th, right? And they also created a ton of wealth creation for employees. So this $250 million grant that I mentioned earlier, it's now worth $750 million, right? So it made a huge difference to people's personal lives as well. Now, these organizations and are all kind of trying, right, to go away from this kind of system, right, that manages compliance, right, to one that unleashes contribution, right? So they're kind of going from bureaucracy to humanocracy, as we like to put it, and it's not a prescriptive system, humanocracy. Different organizations will do things differently depending on their context and their history, but I think there is a shared set of practices, right, that are quite different from the bureaucratic model I mentioned earlier, right? So there are very few layers. You have people who are really accountable to the teams that are doing the work. They are disaggregated. They're defined by small teams, driving their own piece of the business forward. And careers are based on accomplishment, not advancement up a managerial hierarchy, because there's not much of a hierarchy, right? So and there's a lot of coordination and effort that happens laterally, not through vertical command and control. So anyway, those are some of the defining elements of what might be, an alternative model. And what I'd like to do next with you is to get your take on which of these elements are most critical. As you think about your organization, which of these things do you think would be most helpful in driving human accomplishment and human flourishing at work? So I'll turn it back to Henry for our second interactive segment.
We've got a question.
Yeah. Michelle, is that Michelle?
Well, I was just on our table. It's James.
Oh.
We were talking about number 8. Individuals compete to add value. Wondering whether collaboration does it have to be competition rather than collaboration? Yeah,
no, it's a fair point, and I do get that pushback. Yeah, so it's quite often. Yeah, you definitely need collaboration, and maybe competition is the wrong term because it implies a kind of zero-sum nature. But what we wanted to distinguish here is between the way typically, people get ahead in organizations, which is a zero-sum game. There are only so many people at the top, and you're kind of competing with your peers to get that slot above you, right? And so that creates all sorts of crazy political behaviors. And so instead, it's more about friendly competition for who's adding value, and there's no bound on or limit, right, to how much value you can create, because you're not competing for the scarce resource, so that it's promotion. And I'll have an example of that, but that's kind of the intention of that element. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Christina, ask your question.
Okay, so I was just wondering. We had a little chat about this in our room. Is where do you break down an embedded or established bureaucracy, especially if you're not the leader?
Oh, that's the perfect segue to the next section. But I won't get into I won't get into it too much, unfortunately, again, for time constraints. But I think there are ways for you, wherever you sit, to start and experiment with new ways of managing. And then the other thing is that beyond your little unit and what you can do, there is a lot of scope for creating a horizontal movement across the organization where you can kind of get more people to catalyze change and create a movement that is kind of hard for those at the top to stop, right? Because the CEO has, let's say the CEO has like 1,000 power units, and the frontline worker has like 1 power unit. If you get enough frontline workers together to push for change and catalyze change, then that can have a real impact. And I'll mention some of this, and I can go deeper if you'd like, but I agree, because if you just wait for the enlightened CEO to show up, you might have to wait a long time. So it's something hopefully you can kind of get going with without anybody's approval.
Thank you. So just
Okay.
create your little bubble and hold on to it and don't give up.
Yeah. Well, and there's more that you can do, and I'll show you an example in a little bit. There's more you can do to try to kind of to take a policy that is like, you know, blatantly stupid, for instance, or something that doesn't work. There's more you can do than just complain about it. There are ways you could experiment with changes to those policies that are, you know, powerful and also risk bounded. So you're not, you know, you don't kind of you're not going to blow up the whole company, and therefore they're probably more acceptable for people. And so anyway, we'll talk a little bit about that. Maybe
Okay,
very
let's-
experimental, very scrappy. Yeah.
Okay, carry on then, Michele.
All right. Okay, good. Thank you. These are excellent questions, and I appreciate the engagement. So yeah, so how do we go from here to there? Like, how do you, let's, you know, because in a way, Handelsbanken is an interesting example, because you know, but it was like Lady Gaga. It was kind of born that way. Actually, it wasn't really born that way, but they faced an existential crisis, and this Jan Wallander, the CEO, came in and reset the whole organization and their model. Most companies are not facing an existential crisis, and if they do, maybe it's too late. So how do you make progress on this, you know, without you know, being on the back foot, right? And I think the first thing you need to do is recognize the power of management innovation or organizational innovation. I think this is like a very underrated concept. And so let me just spend a few moments talking about it. So, because when it comes to innovation, a lot of people think about it at the level of the kind of the operating model, the business model, et cetera, right? Very few think about it at the level of the management model. But breakthroughs in management, you know, the way you lead, you organize, you work, have paid bigger dividends in performance than innovation in technology, products, or strategy, right? You just think about the invention of the industrial R&D lab by General Electric, or brand management, or lean production, and, you know, bottom up problem solving that Toyota spearheaded, right? And so our take is that leaders will need to be as bold and as committed to the reinventing the organizational model, the management model, as they've been in reinventing the operating model, right? So you kind of need to engage in organizational R&D, right? And when I talk about the management model, it's really just the collection of systems and processes and structures that organizations use. I mean, there's an architectural component, right, that provide the scaffolding, and then there's a set of processes and activities around planning, finance, compliance, and the like, right? And the choices organizations make around these elements matter a lot, right? They inform how resources are allocated, how people get rewarded, whose voices get heard, right? How different units sync up with one another. And you have to work on this in a very systematic, kind of continuous way, in a way that it kind of is bold and new and innovative, as you're not just taking what everybody else in your industry is doing and kind of taking the best of that, because like, what if everybody sucks, right? So you kind of need to kind of think much more boldly than that. And let me just give you a couple of examples of kind of management innovation. So one is around like, how do you make progress on some of these elements that I talked to you earlier? Like, how do you get peer-to-peer coordination? How do you get people to kind of engage in friendly competition to add value? How you do not bound, you know, rewards based on position, but based on value added or an impact, right? And so I'll give you an example, really focused on this element of the management model. Like, how do you reinvent how performance management happens and how performance is rewarded? And this example comes courtesy of W. Gore. Some of you might have heard of the organization, and if you wear rain-proof apparel, waterproof apparel, you're likely using one of their products. You know, they invented Gore-Tex technology and lots of other products. They're consistently ranked as a highly innovative company and as a great place to work. They have about 11,000 people working there, and they describe themselves as operating as a lattice, not a hierarchy. And employees are working in small teams. And here's how their performance review works at Gore. So once a year, every associate is asked to compile a list of 5 to 20 colleagues who have firsthand knowledge of their work, right? And then these nominations are used in a peer rating process based on kind of pairwise comparison. They've evolved the system, so this new iteration has this kind of pairwise comparison element to it. So for instance, assume that Henry and Michelle both list me as a potential reviewer. In this case, the algorithm will identify the match, and I will then be asked to indicate which of the two, Henry or Michele, contributed more to Gore's success over the course of the year. And this happens with the ten thousands of times. So you have a collection of comparisons between people that you've been exposed to, and it creates a pretty natural contribution ranking for every associate, right? And armed with these rankings, then you have local contribution committees that review compensation data to ensure that an individual's pay reflects his or her peer-derived rating, and also stays in sync with that of other peers who are rated the same. So there is calibration, right? So for instance, if the average compensation increases 4%, the increase for someone who has been rated highly might be 15% or so, right? And this system is very interesting because it pushes everyone to think about how they could add value, right? And encourages collaboration, right? Because if Henry comes to me, or I go to Henry and ask him for a request for help on something, like I'll think twice about telling him to get lost, right? Because I might get dinged at the end of the year, right? And so in a way, you're reporting to your peer, not to a boss, and you're more inclined to go the extra mile for colleagues, right? So and this is really a driving force at Gore, that they want people to really be invested in building a better business, as opposed to winning kind of the promotion tournament that I was mentioning earlier. So that's one kind of example. And as I mentioned, Gore has been at this since the beginning, but they've evolved the system, perfected it, adapted it so that it could work at a large scale. So that's one example. Another example, and this is much more kind of scrappy and experimental, and something that I think can be done by many organizations. And this is at the intersection of this idea of transparency that I mentioned earlier in the case of Handelsbanken, and compliance, which is a collection of processes and organizations that are often not favorites in companies. And this comes from a pharma company where a group of mid-level managers, again, not CEOs, they're really committed to getting rid of bureaucracy. And there are many processes they could have chosen to work on, but they focused on travel planning and expense policies. Which is, was as frictionless as a rug burn there, right? So there were strict guidelines for who could travel, for what purpose, so which airline, which class of service, hotel and rental car choices similarly constrained. And so one manager said, I'm responsible for like $100 million in sales, but when I'm traveling, I have to check whether I can get reimbursed for a $3, £3 cup of coffee. It's insane. I'm treated like a child, right? And that, kind of irked people quite a bit. And so what they did, being a pharma company, is they ran an experiment, and they had treatment and control groups. They have about 2 pairs of treatment and control groups, and about 200 people this is like a 70,000 person organization. So they picked 200 people working in the field and working at headquarters. And they were told, the treatment groups, right, were told that for 90 days, they'd be able to make their own travel arrangements, no pre-trip authorizations, no post-trip audits. But there was a catch, right? You basically have to have all your travel expenses posted online for everyone to see. We still need your receipts, so you have to post them, and it's going to be transparent. And so it was really driven by a few hypotheses. The first is that autonomy and transparency would simplify travel planning, reduce frustration, and probably not have too much of an impact on costs, right? And the core idea was that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? Not a thicket of rules. So at the end of the trial, they analyzed the results, and they found, not surprisingly, that people are spending less time on travel and expense matters. And even this like very simple change in policy, it generated quite a bit more of satisfaction. People felt like they were less patronized. Interestingly, I mean, I'll ask you, what do you think happened to the costs in the treatment group? Do you think they went up, down, stay the same? And I'll tell you, the team that ran this experiment thought that the cost would go a little bit higher, but they thought this could be, a price worth paying for, the increasing autonomy and the less time spent on low value added administrative functions. What ended up actually happening is that the costs went down for the experimental group. So, and again, this is like a simple experiment, but it kind of offers a good lesson, I think, in how to challenge a kind of boneheaded policy. Like, instead of complaining about it, try to hack it, try to run an experiment, overcome your learned helplessness, and say, oh, this can only happen if, like, see, the CHRO, the head of compliance blesses it. And obviously you need some sort of air cover, but the ask for running an experiment like this is much smaller than it would be if you were trying to overhaul the whole system all at once, right? And I think this is a really important point. You need to be very experimental in changing your management practices, just the way you're very experimental and very, focused on building prototypes when it comes to a new product and service, right? And my experience, the change that happens, and I can get into this in the Q&A if you'd like, but this kind of experiment that I described to you, you can do this at scale where you're inviting a lot of people inside the organization to help you. Let's say that the issue is reducing friction or increasing innovation. Just ask people for ideas on what they might do. How might they change the different ways in which the companies managed, led, and organized, and then try to think about experiments where you test some hypotheses, and then the ones that work, you kind of scale, right? So, and you can do this at large with large groups of people, thousands of people, and you generate that critical mass of ideas, but also a constituency for change that, as I mentioned earlier, is really hard for people to stop. And I can kind of get into maybe some examples of how this works in practice if you'd like, but maybe now I'll turn it back to you and ask you, like, what is your idea for kind of revolutionizing how your organization is led, managed, and organized? Like, which of these elements of the management model would you change with? Understanding that often, you'll have to eventually change all of them, right, in some way, but is there one that you think is particularly a prime target for a breakthrough management innovation? So that's my question to you for our next segment.
We did have one in the chat from Jason earlier. He was asking, did people feel safe to call out any expenses that seemed too high?
There was some feedback. There were some people asking questions, but remarkably, I think there was a lot of self-discipline. So people, in general, people did the right thing and didn't submit anything that was very questionable because they knew that others would be watching. There was a few backs and forth, but in general, not a lot. Very responsible behavior, which is, by the way, also true when we do this work and we open up discussions around sensitive issues. How should we think about doing leadership development, or what are the biggest barriers to unleashing human potential inside the organizations? Leaders often worry that people are, when you open things up, are going to be very incendiary and go on rants and very polemical. But my experience is that people typically are quite responsible and take whatever freedom and voice that they have very seriously.
Okay, Jane, tell us, ask your question.
Yeah, I just wondered if you had any examples of humanocracy in the healthcare sector, which here in the NHS is a large, we operate in large NHS trusts, sometimes with thousands of employees that are then broken down. So we're all meant to function by, universal rules and universal pay scales, and yet we're trying to be dynamic and nimble at the front line to do things differently that will actually work. But there are so many layers above that.
Healthcare is extremely challenging. I struggle to come up with good examples, especially at large scale. The one that I'm sure you're familiar with, if not, I can give you the 30-second version, is Bureaucracy. They do home health care, which home nursing. And they, the interesting thing about Bureaucracy is, it was founded by a nurse Josse Block, who was working in that kind of context you described, and said, I can't change it from the inside, so I need to go outside. And he created Bureaucracy as a nonprofit that then contracts with the government, contracts with healthcare insurance companies to deliver services. And they think I have the largest share of that sector in the Netherlands, and they've inspired other organizations to act the way they do, which is to empower frontline nurses to basically do what's right for patients. and unencumbered by all those layers, all those processes. And they've done that in a way that not only improves health outcomes, but also makes nurses happier and they'll work more efficient. And now Buurtzorg is trying to do this in other sectors. I know there are GPs in the Netherlands who have taken this same idea. They call themselves Buurtz doctors. So they're trying to create the GP practices that operate in this kind of way, where they are able to self-manage and they're supported by a small center to deal with the administration. It's still early to tell whether that works, but to me that's the best example. And I know they're also doing it with mental health. They created little bubbles of Buurtzorg that go beyond home health and home nursing. It's too early to tell, but it does give me a sense that it's possible, right? It gives me hope that it's definitely possible. And it's just a matter of like trying this, demonstrating it works, and mustering the political will to make the change. One of the things that really helped Buurtzorg is support from the Dutch Ministry of Health and a minister who spent time with the Buurtzorg nurses and came away in tears, understanding how that work was fundamentally better. And that minister then said, we need to kind of help Buurtzorg thrive and export this model more broadly. So we need that as well. I mean, you need the example, but then you also need the political will. Sorry, very long question, very long answer to your question, but hopefully somewhat helpful.
And also there's somebody who wants to know if it can work in the charity sector.
Yeah, I mean, Buurtzorg is a nonprofit. I mean, in a way, it should work better, right? Because you don't have necessarily the same, level of, maybe short-term pressure. I mean, I know nonprofits have their own short-term pressures as well. But yeah, I mean, it's a universal model. I've seen, this can work anywhere, really. And that's one of the things I often get to push back. Well, Michele, you don't understand. It doesn't work, in our sector because it's highly regulated or whatever. Yeah, maybe there's some constraints and maybe your solutions will be different. But I think there are ways to experiment, take these principles and apply them in whatever context you operate in.
Okay, Jack.
It's really just a question of what it looks like, because I think we're trying to do this at our place of work, which is tiny. So you're talking about thousands. We've got 16 part-time workers, charity, domestic abuse, and anti-poverty, but we still have 4 managers, and one of those managers manages a supervisor as well. And there's 16 of us. But that's less than it was. But the idea of managers being more accountable to our teams. How does that look like? What does that look like in reality? I mean, it's not just about bureaucracy, is it? Or is it?
Yeah, well, so first of all, you might want to say, like, what is the work they're doing that it really adds value, and what that isn't? What isn't really adding value? And even the work that they're doing that add value, how much of it should they be doing, or how much of it should you be doing? As I said before, like, even at a place like Buurtzorg, the work of managing doesn't go away just because, you don't have managers, but everybody's a manager.
Yeah.
Right. And so a nurse at Buurtzorg does financial record keeping or deals with recruiting and other things on their own. So they're like mini managers, right? And so making managers accountable is really having you as sort of persons on the receiving end of being managed, a way to express this is actually helpful, this is actually isn't, and a method to hold, to basically vote your leader or your manager off the island if they're not adding value. I mean, there's a really good example of this very kind of unusual management system from China, from a company called Haier. They're the largest appliance maker. But if they are also organized in small units, but if a unit doesn't do well, like in terms of performance over a couple quarters, the employees can basically say, I want a leadership election. We want to challenge this person who's not leading us effectively. So you need to have mechanisms with teeth, not some sort of anonymous 360 survey that doesn't go anywhere. But people need to be right. Need able to say, like, we're not getting the value we need from managers, from our manager, and real recourses.
Okay, over to you, Maureen. Who's got a question?
Everything's clear. We're happy. We're happy. Henry, happy.
You're happy? You're okay?
Yes. Yes. We've got thumbs. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, no questions.
No questions.
All right,
we can move on.
Okay. Can I just maybe Harry, can you just give me just 2 minutes? Because I
Yeah.
wanted to just leave us with just a couple of parting thoughts. And by the way, your questions, your feedback has been very helpful. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you online. If you want, you can find me there.
Yeah, yeah.
But you know, as you think about reimagining your organization, I really would like to challenge you to aim really high. You know, because as managers and leaders, we often seem to suffer from ADD, ambition deficit disorder, right? We're negotiators, we're organizers, we're enforcers, but we're seldom dreamers, you know, adventurers, rebels. And I think that if you want to create organizations that are radically more human-centric, right, you really need to change that, right? And so, you know, too often when, you know, you're challenged to do something that is radically different, you know, the question is like, who's already done it? And it's a legitimate question, right? Like, of course, like maybe there are some benchmarks that can inspire us and so on. But I think that the fundamental question you should start with is it worth doing, right? This is, you know, the little like Insight Lander, you know, which is, you know, operates a $150 million drill to, you know, and it was shipped to the surface of Mars. You know, NASA didn't benchmark anybody. They decided this is worth doing, right? And so I think we need to be as ambitious as management practitioners, right? And so as you seek, you know, ways to enable, you know, extraordinary accomplishment, you know, please don't be afraid to aim high. You know, I don't think there's a more noble goal than the one of making organizations more daring, more resilient, more human-centric. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, for your questions, the discussion, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue in, you know, after the conference is over. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.